On March 28, 2026, David Anthony Burke spent his 21st birthday in a mansion that his management team had been renting for him in the Hollywood Hills. This may possibly be David's last birthday celebrated in the free world, because on April 16, 2026, David was arrested at that same residence and charged with the murder of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. If he's found guilty, David faces decades in prison, if not the death penalty.
There was an evil version of myself that would kind of come out at random moments. He would commit the crimes that I would have to solve as a detective. I'd be like solving murders that I'm committing myself.
Right now, David's pleading not guilty, but with his preliminary hearing on July 21st, 2026, with prosecutors claiming they have 40 terabytes worth of evidence against David, with the death penalty still on the table, it'll be up to the judge to review the evidence and determine if there's sufficient probable cause for the first-degree murder and related charges to proceed to a full jury trial against David. Do prosecutors have the evidence they need to lock David up for life and bring justice to Celeste's family? Will David end up taking a plea and getting out of jail a lot sooner than the world thought? We're gonna unpack it all, starting from the day that David was taken away.
Tonight, dramatic video captured by TMZ showing the tense moments LAPD officers arrested singer David on suspicion of murdering a teenage girl who had been found dead in the trunk of his car.
If you try to run or if you try to resist, you will get hit with non-lethal and get hurt. I got you.
In footage obtained by the California Post, officers in tactical gear are seen walking him in handcuffs yesterday on the streets of the Hollywood Hills.
Look, it's going to obscure my view from the gate. It's good?
If you try to run or if you try to resist, you will get hit with non-lethal and get hurt.
I got you.
If you try to run, we have canine on premises and you will get bit.
I got you. All right, so the gate is locked. Do I open the gate? Open the gate.
Now, before we dive into what prosecutors and the world knows about not only David's relationship with Celeste, but also why they believe David actually had the intention and carried out the murder and mutilation of Celeste, we first got to understand a key roadblock in this case that may actually work in David's favor. And that is the condition that authorities actually found Celeste's body in. It was completely dismembered in 2 separate plastic bags in that front trunk. Because of that, Celeste's cause of death may end up being the centerpiece of the trial. Without a clear cause of death, without knowing if it was a homicide, an accidental overdose, it becomes a weapon that David's defense can use against prosecutors. How can they prove he was the one behind this if they don't even know how she died to begin with? Well, we would quickly start getting some answers. Prosecutors say that David actually murdered Celeste on April 23rd, 2025, but had ended up mutilating her body on May 5th. She was then left in that Tesla under his name for 4 more months until September. LAPD would do a conference where they said that David is not just charged with first-degree murder, but also with mutilating a body and lewd and lascivious acts with a child under the age of 14. He's also charged with interfering with an active investigation, trying to protect his career and hide from the charges he would have initially been faced with, which was that he was having S relations with a minor under the age of 14.
Today, I am announcing the charges against David Anthony Burke in connection with the brutal and horrific murder of Celeste, a 14-year-old at that time. And there are 3 sets of charges that have been brought. The first-degree murder with special circumstances, and again, those special circumstances are lying in wait. That Celeste went to Mr. Burke's home on the night of April 23rd, 2025, as alleged in the complaint, at his invitation, and again, was not heard from again. The second is a special circumstance being that this murder was committed for financial gain. As the evidence will show in court, the financial gain was for Mr. Burke to maintain his very lucrative musical career that Celeste was threatening on that particular night. The third charge, in addition to lying in wait and for financial gain, is murdering a witness to an investigation. In this particular case, as the evidence will come out in court, the witness to the investigation was Celeste. And the investigation was into the lewd and lascivious sexual acts committed by Mr. Burke that is the subject of count 2 of this complaint with Celeste while she was under 14 years.
Now, David would show up to court on Monday, April 20th, and maintain his innocence, pleading not guilty to the charges against him. His legal team would also claim that they received no evidence, no discovery that prosecutors have thus far collected, no autopsy reports, no information that David could use to defend himself in court.
Calling People versus David Anthony Burke. Good afternoon, Mr. Burke.
Deputy District Attorney Beth Silverman for the People, Your Honor.
Thank you. And you're requesting a preliminary hearing within the period.
Yes, Your Honor. From the media reports, apparently there have been 4 months of secret grand jury proceedings. We believe that Mr. Burke is entitled at the earliest opportunity to an open preliminary hearing and the proceedings not be done in secret. So we are asking for a preliminary hearing to be set at the earliest possible date on the 10th day. We believe the actual evidence will show David Burke did not murder Celeste Rivas Hernandez, nor was he the cause of her death. And we would like to be able to have the evidence come into the light of day at the earliest opportunity in order to establish that. We're asking for April 23rd as a 3 of 10, Your Honor.
We'll be very happy to put on the evidence that we've collected in this case in the last several months.
Plea of not guilty has been entered on behalf of Mr. Burke. The matter is ordered assigned to Judge Charlene Almeida.
Yes, Your Honor. If I may just put on the record, we have, as soon as the people arrived, delivered a informal discovery request consistent with Penal Code Section 1054. We have been given almost no discovery thus far. We've received a 3-page follow-up report, no autopsy report, and a copy of the complaint. And we would ask the people respectfully to produce discovery at the earliest opportunity.
Now, the prosecutor would claim that there were over 40 terabytes of evidence in this case, and some of it has already been released, which we'll break down shortly in this video.
There's approximately 40 terabytes of discovery in this case. Moreover, in order to obtain the transcripts from a grand jury investigation, counsel has to file a motion. She knows the way the system works. I'm not able to gather those. They have to be provided after the court orders them released because it was an investigation. Second of all, if counsel plans on going to a preliminary hearing within the 10 days, it is unlikely that there will be very much discovery provided within that period, given the voluminous nature and how long it's going to take to copy onto drives. In addition to that, the coroner's report was sealed in this case in order to prevent it from hampering truthful testimony from witnesses that testified at the grand jury. So an order will also have to be obtained in order to get the coroner's department, which is now the medical examiner's department, to release those materials.
It's surprising news given the district attorney's office held a press conference this morning where they discussed the cause of death, apparently under seal and not released by the coroner's office, as did the robbery homicide unit to the press. So we would again reiterate, we believe that Mr. Burke is entitled to discovery. We have served the people with notice. They have 15 days to produce discovery in this case. We would ask that they do that in conscientious earnestness and as quickly as possible.
Bail to stand at no bail. Thank you.
So as you can see, David made his first appearance in court in late April, and many people were questioning why it took so long for prosecutors to actually formally charge David. Celeste's remains were discovered inside the front trunk of David's Tesla in September of 2025, yet David wasn't arrested until April 2026, 7 months later, and nearly a year after prosecutors alleged that Celeste's life was taken. But throughout that time period, prosecutors appear to have been building their case, reportedly presenting evidence and testimony to grand juries on 7 separate occasions. That evidence is now being revealed publicly at the preliminary hearing. David has pleaded not guilty, and his lawyers can now question witnesses and challenge the prosecution's claims. We'll break down all the evidence that's been presented, and first let's understand the prosecution's overall goal with this preliminary hearing.
Good afternoon. My name is Nathan Hockman. I'm the Los Angeles County District Attorney. Today starts the day of the preliminary hearing of David Anthony Burke, the singer David, spelled D4vd. This preliminary hearing will last approximately 3 to 5 days, at which point we will be seeking to hold David to answer for 3 felony counts of which he has been charged. First-degree murder with special circumstances, the count of lewd and lascivious acts with a 13-year-old, and the count of mutilation of human remains. David will be facing a maximum punishment of life without the possibility of parole, or he is also death penalty eligible. The decision on whether or not to seek the death penalty has not been made at this point. The point of a preliminary hearing is somewhat different than you actually perceive in the media, whether it's TV or the movies. Because what often happens in TV or the movies is you go from an immediate arrest into a trial. But in our system and in California in particular, you have an intermediate step. That intermediate step is a preliminary hearing where effectively the prosecution's evidence is going to be tested before a judge, not a jury. The standard that we have to meet is not beyond a reasonable doubt at the preliminary hearing stage. It is probable cause. We are not obligated, nor will we be presenting all the evidence at a preliminary hearing that we will be presenting at a trial to prove David beyond a reasonable doubt guilty of the 3 felony charges of which he has been charged. So at the preliminary hearing, we will call a number of officers. We estimate there will be over 10 different witnesses, both officer testimony, coroner testimony, and there will be individual witnesses as well. And again, we can rely on hearsay and other things that won't be allowed to be relied on in an actual trial. The judge at the end of the presentation of the evidence, and again, this is evidence that can be cross-examined by a defense attorney, and that process has already been done. At the end of the presentation of all this evidence, the question will be, will David be held to answer on the 3 felony charges? We believe we will more than accomplish the evidentiary burden of probable cause at this point to hold David to answer on these 3 felony charges. At that point, if the judge does hold him to answer, we will file an information that will detail the actual 3 criminal charges. Thereafter, there will be a trial date that will be set, and David, if he so chooses, will proceed to trial. And we will prove at that point, beyond a reasonable doubt, that David committed these 3 crimes. And when, we do not predict if, when he is convicted, we will then be seeking the sentence that we are allowed to seek by order of law, and we will let you know in a future date whether or not that sentence will also include the death penalty. I wanted to take this opportunity as we're starting this preliminary hearing process to explain where the preliminary hearing fits in the process so people can understand as we are presenting evidence and it is being cross-examined what ultimately the standard is for the judge to determine, and that's probable cause, not beyond a reasonable doubt. It is a judge that is doing this determination, not a jury at this point, and that there will subsequently be a trial when the judge holds David to answer on these 3 felony charges.
Let's start with day 1 of the preliminary hearing. Now, to understand the context behind the witnesses that were brought up to speak at the first day of David's preliminary hearing, we gotta understand the story that prosecutors were painting in the initial complaint against David. LAPD robbery homicide detectives determined that Celeste and David had actually met in January of 2022 when Celeste was just 11, and they were alleged to have begun a S relation in November of 2023 when Celeste was just 13. By February of 2024, Celeste had went missing, and the sheriff department in Riverside County, Celeste's hometown, had actually contacted David when she first went missing because they found his number in a phone that belonged to Celeste. During that phone call, David had told authorities that he spoke to Celeste a couple days beforehand but was unaware that she was an A minor or that she was even reported missing. After this phone call, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department actually went to David's home to conduct a welfare check. And the first witness at the first day of the preliminary hearing was one of the sheriffs that visited David's home during that February 2024 welfare check. They also showed body cam footage of that officer going into David's home, searching it as well as speaking to him.
Of Celeste, I'll be honest with you, the body cam footage was disappointing. Not in terms of it didn't show much, but it was disappointing in terms of it felt like the officers maybe could have done a little bit more to investigate. They kind of sort of, I don't want to say let David off the hook, but when they visited his property and kind of were asking about this missing minor, it was very surprising. They didn't really put it on him. We heard rumors that they had gone to his property and told him she's 13 and warned him. That's not really what we saw in that footage. I'm not trying to defend David by any means, but they basically went to his property, said, look, we're looking for this girl, is she here? They searched the property, she wasn't there. David, honestly, he seemed very nervous, and I'm not saying that he wasn't up to nothing dodgy. He did kind of seem a little bit nervous, but he was forthcoming. He said, oh yeah, I know her. I thought she was 18. She told me that she was 18. Other people trying to tell me she's 13 now. He showed them a picture of her on his phone. He showed them the, alleged, it's been alleged that it's a yearbook photo, but it looked more just like a sort of random picture of her. But that was kind of the first witness who basically, was on the stand and described going to David's property. We saw the body cam footage, and then David's defense, they kind of had a good little moment when they said, well, at no point did you say definitively that she's 13. I'm pretty sure the way that it was worded, he was kind of like, I think she might be 13. It wasn't clear. It wasn't definitive, and it made you think, damn, like, that's not quite what we thought that we was actually going to be hearing. So that one, I'm not going to lie, that it was definitely not good for David, but it was also, there were little holes that his defense poked into it, and they were doing a very good job of poking holes in things.
So they answered the call. David said, I've been on the phone with the cops. And they said straight up, they said, is Celeste here? And it was like the way that they started, it sounded like they was going to play hardball with him. It's like, oh yeah, how you doing? Yeah. Is Celeste here? And then he's like, nah. He said, they just last spoke when I was in Australia. He was like, I was out the country. I just got back from Australia. I was on tour. I thought he sounded super nervous to begin with. And then he gets a little bit more confidence as the interaction goes on. I'd say David spoke very fast in the body cam footage. They're asking him questions like, when did you last speak? He's like, last week, I just got back from Australia. So I believe he did tell them that he had spoken to her last on the 13th of February. Again, he had that information ready to go, quick time answer. 13th February, like he was quick time with the answer. He explained to them that they met at the end of 2021 on Discord, said outright it was like a video game chat room, and that they'd continue to communicate on Discord, Instagram, Facebook, but mainly on Discord. That's where they met specifically, on Discord through a video game chat room. They basically asked him if he has any tattoos, and I didn't actually hear the response to that. David even offers the cop like a drink from his fridge, and they're not interested. They basically asked, Celeste's cell phone number? He gives it over. He gives several numbers for her. And then basically says, look, the only time I ever met her was on November the 12th, 2023 at the beach. And he said an address where the beach was, where he met them. Again, he had all this information ready to go straight off the top. So he gave like a more recent phone number for her. He's like, this is the last number I communicated with her on. And he was being very cooperative. Now, knowing what we know now, it's easy to be more suspicious. But at the time, the cops possibly just thought, look, this guy's super cooperative. He's given all the info. He's probably worried about her. Probably thinks he's in some weird shit, even having an interaction with this girl. And he says, I've got a picture of her. I can show you a picture. If you're looking for her, she's missing. I'll show you a picture of her. He was quick on his feet with it. So from there, he explained, we met a couple of years ago. We spoke on and off. They asked if she knows if she frequents the area, and he was sort of like, I don't know. That was one of the answers where I'd say he looked the most nervous. When they said, do you know if she frequents this area in West Hollywood? He's like, oh, no, I don't know. That was sort of like where he was looking a bit sus and a bit scared, because to be honest, he probably didn't know how to answer that one. He probably didn't think of that one, because it's like, sounds like she did frequent the area, and it sounds like she frequented a couple of them properties. So I feel like that was one where he was like not prepared for that, but it flew under the radar. So David said outright, oh, she told me she was 18. That's what he said. And then he said to the cops, he said this, he volunteered this information. People have been telling me she's 13, but she said she's 18. And so he basically said, yeah, they're saying that the yearbook picture that I've got on my phone was taken a year before, like, I met her. And so I'm thinking, he didn't say this, but it's like he was sort of inferring. It's like, oh, she told me she was 18, and this yearbook picture of hers going around, and I heard it was taken a year before, and like maybe that was 17. He doesn't say 17, but that's sort of what he's inferring. So he basically says he's tried to contact her. The phone is dead. At one point, he even said, oh, this is like a movie, which is fucking crazy, because it's like a movie watching him go through it in trial, to be honest with you.
Now, I might sound like a broken record here, but you have to remember that the point of this preliminary hearing is to present all the evidence to the judge, and the judge must then decide if there's enough evidence for this case to go to trial. During the presentation of all this evidence and all the witnesses coming forward, David's defense team's job is to poke holes in everything that prosecutors show to the judge. Because obviously, if they could show the judge that there's inconsistencies with everything prosecutors are bringing forth, the judge might think that there's not enough of a case to even bring this to trial to begin with. And remember again that David is pleading not guilty. Now, the second witness on day one was actually the robbery homicide detective who was on the scene when Celeste's body was found in the front trunk of David's Tesla. During the hearing, pictures were also shown of Celeste's remains and how they were discovered in the trunk. Now, just a trigger warning, I'm going to show a courtroom sketch that depicts a lot of the images that were shown throughout the hearing, and I will blur out anything that's too graphic. As you can see here, there were pictures shown of the Tesla with the front trunk open, pictures of Celeste's finger that had the shush tattoo on it, all of the stuff that authorities found in David's home throughout their searches, like the burn cage, the chainsaw, the knife, the inflatable pool, all things that were allegedly used for mutilation, as well as images that I've blurred out of Celeste's decomposed, cut body that was in bags in the front trunk of David's Tesla. But like I said, it was still David's defense team's job to poke holes at all the evidence presented. And that's exactly what they tried to do when the robbery homicide detective presented this evidence during the hearing.
That testimony in court, it was honestly just sickening to see the footage of what was found in that car, to hear the testimony of the officer that actually dealt with that. It was just honestly just horrifying. That was extremely bad, and really that was kind of very, very damning. There wasn't really much to defend on that front, but what they did manage to do was the defense pointed out some very, very interesting holes in that basically timeline of when the body was discovered and recovered. They basically pointed out some inconsistencies with the fact that it was kind of a local police department that opened the Tesla, exposed the first bag. It was then the detectives from the robbery homicide division that then came and moved the first bag, discovered the second bag underneath it in the Tesla, and then it was the medical examiner that then came to the scene and was the only person to authorize to touch the body. Now, one point that they made that was very, very interesting was they basically said, why didn't you keep the body bag? They never kept the body bag that Celeste was unfortunately found in. They basically disposed of it, and they disposed of, and it's disgusting to say, I'm so sorry to say this, but the liquefied remains that were inside that bag, they basically said we didn't really have the means to preserve that. That was unpreservable. What we did is we cut the handles off the body bag that might have had DNA on it, and we kept obviously the core remains, but they basically admit we don't have the body bag. I don't know where it is. They sort of said, oh, was it destroyed? And they said, oh, we wouldn't say destroyed, but it was not, we couldn't preserve it. It was just liquefied remains in a bag, in a mesh bag that was just, half a leftover garbage bag. It was not preservable. Now that unfortunately did look quite bad on the prosecution to sort of say, this is a really, really important thing. Why didn't you preserve it? And them arguing, well, we couldn't preserve it. It wasn't preservable. Didn't really kind of land for some people. I feel like for a lot of people it felt like that really wasn't a good enough answer, and it sort of made you think, okay, there's some inconsistencies here. And I'll be honest with you, I think the prosecution had a pretty hard time when they started talking about all the evidence that was claimed from David's property. Now, there was some pretty bad timeline stuff. We've heard all these rumors of David had a chainsaw, he had multiple chainsaws in his property, but it turns out there were actually 3 chainsaws. There were 2 chainsaws that were ordered off Amazon that were found in his property, and neither of those had any DNA on it. Apparently neither of those had blood on them, neither of those actually had any of his DNA or his evidence on them, and you know, the cops ended up leaving them there. They talked about the burn cage, which wasn't used. They talked about not being able to find an apparent, you know, heat-proof mat that was ordered on Amazon, and really the alleged chainsaw that this dismemberment was allegedly carried out with apparently was never found, and it sounds like that was something that was Uber Eats or Postmates to him. He'd kind of ordered a shovel, this other chainsaw, and it did make you think, is this the play that he's going for? The actual chainsaw that he used has been vanished, has been disappeared, but the 2 chainsaws that they found in his property that he ordered off Amazon that didn't have any evidence on them that they were used in a crime. That really throws people off the scent, and it makes you wonder, okay, what do we actually have? They allegedly have the cadaver bags being ordered off Amazon, but they don't have the bags themselves. That evidence they said they wasn't able to preserve, so that doesn't really look too good. I was very surprised that we heard talk of all this searching going on in the property, but we didn't actually get a concrete confirmation. I didn't hear at any point them mention blood being found in the garage, which I thought was something that was going to be brought up. Maybe that's going to be brought up later. They did bring up the blue kiddie pool that was found in the garage, and they said they did recover that, and you know, the plastic pieces were, you know, found, it's horrible to say, but lodged in her the severance wounds on her limbs, but there were definitely a few things that just didn't quite add up. The fact that it was to find out these 2 chainsaws that we've been hearing about for so long hadn't been used in the dismemberment, that was very, very shocking, to be honest with you, and I feel like I was very, very surprised. And it sounds like whatever that chainsaw that was actually used to do this dismemberment is long gone, apparently. They haven't been able to recover that.
Now, another thing presented at the hearing was a bunch of data that authorities extracted from David's phone and other technology devices. Remember that authorities believe David and Celeste had began an S relationship in late 2023. They also alleged that David had actually traveled with Celeste out of country, booking her flight tickets as an accompanied minor. During the hearing, prosecutors showed that while searching David's devices, they were able to discover an email address belonging to David where airline tickets were booked for both him and Celeste.
They were able to do, through a warrant, just extractions from his phone, which apparently was an iPhone 16 Pro, and it was Pro Max, called the Tranquilizer. And this phone, by the way, has never physically been located. And this was the phone disconnected on the 29th. So per Celebrate activity, you know, they were kind of showing us sort of the places that he went, and they were screenshotting some of these places from the infotainment center on the Tesla and matching it up to the iCloud. For example, we had a trip identified in navigation to Santa Barbara and Lake Cachuma, plus a Tesla charge in San Ynez Valley in May of 2025, a month after they believe she was killed. There was another location of interest, a charging station on 729, which is on the way to Santa Barbara as well. And they found surveillance footage from a home nearby when he parked the Tesla on July 29th, 2025, the alleged last time that it was in his possession. And they showed us just multiple angles of him getting out, going into his home, you know, and that's that. They talked about getting a search warrant for the home as well, where they went over the evidence that we kind of already knew about. The burn cage, they found that in a box behind the piano. They found a blue iPhone 15 that belonged to David. And, you know, they also said they found a tower computer where there was another email address. And this email address was also connected to the iPhone that, or the iCloud data that he had. And it's follow it, which is FALLIT, and some numbers at gmail.com. And they actually found through that email or through that iCloud on the tower computer several flights that David had booked between I think it was LA to Texas and LA to London for both he and Celeste. There was also purchases made under another alias besides Victoria Mendez, Travion Davis, I believe it was. Yeah, also the red Tesla in the garage, they were showing us photos when they were discussing the search warrant. They said that was registered to Robert Morgenroth, and they identified him as David's manager and, quote, personal assistant. I found that to be interesting.
Now, you might also be curious how authorities actually confirmed that the decomposing, mutilated body in the front trunk of a Tesla that belonged to David was actually the body of Celeste. Well, if you guys remember back when it was first uncovered that a body was found in a car that belonged to David, there was massive reporting of this in the news. And at that point in time, on September 10th, about 2 days after the body was uncovered, Celeste's father had actually theorized that it may be his own daughter's body in that car. And so he made the call to authorities, and they confirmed that that was the case.
How they also identified Celeste, Jesus Rivas called LAPD Communications on September 10th after he saw lots of media coverage on the 8th, and he said, look, I think this might be my daughter. And basically, he used his son as an interpreter, or Celeste's brother, and he was able to provide LAPD or the medical examiner's office with her dentist's office so they could, identify the dental records, and it was her. And also, he did say that per Jesus Rivas, that she had 2 different phone numbers, and he gave them to police. And then they also found out that she had a 3rd phone number that no one knew. And when the detective said her name, he said, did he say his daughter's name? He said, yes, it was Celeste Abigail Rivas Hernandez. That was very sad. It was a very sad moment to hear her full name.
Absolutely horrifying. And to add another layer to the tragedy of this case, the loss of life of this child, is the fact that the crime may have been committed to keep Celeste silent, all for financial gain. Prosecutors had alleged that between text message conversations amongst David and Celeste, it had shown that their quote-unquote relationship was getting turbulent. Celeste began getting jealous of David interacting with other girls, and because of that, she threatened to come forth to authorities on the fact that he was having S relations with an A minor, aka herself. Prosecutors believe that this could have been David's motive for actually taking Celeste's life, and a big reason why the death penalty for David is actually on the table is because this case may have been murder for financial gain. On day 2 of the preliminary hearing, one of Law and Crime Network's reporters were actually sitting right behind David in the courthouse, and she described how David looked, as well as some of the financial related matters that were discussed during day 2 of the hearing. Because again, David's music career was highly successful. He was making not just himself, but a lot of people around him a lot of money. Profit splits are relevant to this case because it was possibly not just David who had the incentive of keeping Celeste quiet so that David's career in music could continue to grow.
I was sitting right behind David this morning. I somehow got a seat in front of where they were seating other reporters. I think it's because I actually walked in a little bit later than everybody else did. So because of that, they had me seated on the end of one of the attorneys' rows in that courtroom, and I was right behind David. He didn't look too great. His hair is grown out. He is unshaven. He's wearing that LA County jail uniform, that orange jumpsuit, and he still has his feet and his waist shackled. He's not wearing handcuffs, though, so he was kind of splayed out in his chair, arms on his armrests. I could see his yellow legal notepad that he had laid out in front of him, so I was trying to take a peek, trying to see if he was taking any notes. He didn't have anything written down, but there definitely were moments this morning during cross-examination of witnesses where he did lean in and talk to his attorneys. The first time I noticed that, it was during cross-examination related to financial management. They were essentially talking about how much money he made through his record deal and how that money was divvied up. Because so many people were involved in this operation. So many people were making money off of him, to put it bluntly. And that's a key part of this case, because murder for financial gain is one of the special circumstances here that makes this eligible for the death penalty.
Now, as far as evidence that was displayed during the second day of the preliminary hearing, we saw more detail into what was found in that Tesla where Celeste's body was stored and discovered. It's absolutely disgusting to imagine, but they actually found dozens of air fresheners in the car, showing that whoever was truly behind this crime was extremely calculated in not just dismembering and packaging the body in compact spaces. And I don't want to use the word calculated. I take that back, because in the grand scheme of things, there was nothing calculated about the fact that authorities had already spoken to David a year prior about Celeste being 13, and a year later she's found in a car that belongs to him. So while calculated is definitely the wrong word, the fact that he was ordering burn cages, pools, shovels, chainsaws, the fact that the car was polluted with air fresheners to try and cover the scent, it shows that there was a deliberate effort to wipe this poor child's memory off the face of the earth, which is so disgusting to think about.
We were hearing testimony from an LAPD criminologist. This was one of the officers called to investigate after the Tesla was towed to one of their tech centers. So we were looking at photos the prosecutor was showing the court of 11 different air fresheners that were found in that Tesla. I mean, Celeste's remains had been in there decomposing, likely for months. So to cover up that smell, somebody put nearly a dozen air fresheners, not just inside the car, but actually in the front trunk.
Yeah.
And that's where the cadaver bags with her remains were found. It's not just that this crime was committed, it's that somebody went to truly horrifying lengths, Jesse, to try and cover up their tracks. I could see her parents kind of shrinking into themselves and moving a little bit closer together when those photos came up. There's so many elements of this that are horrifying in ways I don't think we can fully imagine for them.
Now, as far as understanding how David may have thought he would attempt to dispose of any evidence related to the crime if he allegedly committed it, prosecutors had also found an ID card that belonged to Celeste in Santa Barbara County the day after they believe David had taken Celeste's life. Around that same time period, David had began doing interviews in promotion of his new album, which ties into prosecutors' theories that the motivation behind taking Celeste's life was in order to protect David's career. David takes her life, disposes of evidence far away in Santa Barbara County, and then goes on to promote his music as if nothing happened. But simultaneously, David's defense team will use this to his advantage to say, if he was really busy taking a child's life and driving cross-country to dispose of the evidence, how could he possibly also have the time and the emotional bandwidth to go on and do interviews and discuss something as lighthearted as his music career? Well, that's where the next witness in the preliminary hearing comes into play.
Someone from the California Highway Patrol testified, right? Can you tell us who that person was and what they testified to?
So this was interesting for me personally, Jesse. It was a CHP officer, California Highway Patrol. He's assigned to the Santa Barbara area. As soon as he walked in and they said that, I thought, oh, here we go. This is going to be the piece of testimony during prelim related to Lake Cachuma up in Santa Barbara County. So I love that area. I love Santa Barbara. I actually took a road trip up there a couple of weeks ago, back in June, because I wanted to check out State Road 154 myself. We all read in court documents that a Caltrans worker back in January apparently found Celeste's ID up there. And prosecutors have been alleging that David took a trip up there the day after Celeste was allegedly stabbed and left to bleed to death. He allegedly drove up there in his own car to dispose of the evidence. So this morning, the CHP officer testified that he was called to the scene after that Caltrans worker found the passport card. We actually saw a photo of that passport card. We saw a photo of exactly where, just off the roadway, it was reportedly found. And then we heard some back and forth where defense attorneys cross-examined him and asked, was there any traffic control? Do you know if it was found face up or face down? Was it buried under anything? Did it just rain a day or two ago? So there are questions about how exactly it ended up there. But it was very interesting to hear from a witness who was actually called to that scene after I drove up there myself, because I was curious about where, off the roadway, how close to the lake this could have happened.
And the defense is questioning exactly how that passport card would have gotten there, that there were maybe other means other than David allegedly tossing it?
Absolutely. It sounds like they're setting up an argument where they could say that it was washed over there, by rainwater. It did just rain, I think, a day or two before it was found by that Caltrans worker beginning of January of this year. So this is months after the body was found last September. And this is more than half a year after she died last April. So there are a lot of questions about how it ended up there. I imagine the prosecution later on, they're going to share evidence about the drive up there, because they are alleging that David took that trip in his own car. I don't believe the remains of Celeste were in that front trunk just yet. Again, this was April 24th, so that would have been the day after the alleged stabbing. And then later that day, this was wild, Jesse. We haven't talked about this yet in court during the preliminary hearing, but I know you read this in the initial documents. That same day of the Santa Barbara road trip, April 24th, David went back home and then taped an interview promoting his album that came out the next day.
And I wonder if the defense, so the prosecution will say, my gosh, look at what he's doing, right? Pretty sick. The defense could say, if he really brutally killed someone, he's going to do an interview right after? I mean, is that what we're expected to believe? I wonder if that's where they're going to go.
Now remember, on day one of the preliminary hearing, prosecutors showed the judge a bunch of images of evidence they gathered within David's house. Chainsaws, knives, an inflatable pool. Well, on day 3 of the preliminary hearing, they called a criminologist to the stand who did forensic evidence related to that inflatable pool and how it might have tied it into Celeste's life being taken away.
We heard from another criminalist from LAPD. She did the actual forensic analysis of the inflatable pool, in addition to material that was sent to her by the LA County Medical Examiner's Office that was collected during the victim's autopsy. Now, that includes, I mentioned, her soiled clothing and bits of blue plastic found during the autopsy that were essentially embedded in her remains. So this criminalist actually pieced those bits of blue plastic in with the rest of the inflatable pool that she processed and analyzed, including work that was done under a microscope. And there were exhibits shown during court today, photos of how those pieces from the autopsy fit in like a puzzle with the rest of that blue inflatable pool. So there was a bit of back and forth. The prosecutor spent quite a bit of time questioning this witness, Lisa Lahendro from LAPD, about her background, her expertise, how she did this work, and what it showed. They described the linear cuts in the pool, exactly where in the pool she noted them. There were 4 different areas of damage, what she found on the underside of the pool, and how this all fits in with the larger picture that's being painted, which is that Celeste may have been dismembered in this pool.
Now, this hearing only gets more horrifying, and what's heartbreaking to know is that Celeste's family had been sitting through all of the evidence being displayed over the last 3 days. Her parents had to look as prosecutors displayed images of their daughter with a completely dismembered body months after her life was possibly taken. They had to look at photos of the clothing she wore in her final moments. They had to look at the very suspect sitting there in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit as they watch how prosecutors believe their daughter's life was taken.
I can't believe they're back in the courtroom today. You know, they sat through all of day one of this preliminary hearing, all of day two. They walked in a little bit later this morning. They didn't show up until about 10:30, but they did catch all of this testimony from Lisa Lahendro. They did sit in the courtroom and see these exhibits, these photos of what their daughter was wearing when her remains were found. They did see the little bits of hair and plastic that were collected during her autopsy and how those bits of plastic fit with damage from this blue inflatable pool. I didn't see any kind of visible physical reaction. You know, on day one, Mercedes, the victim's mother, she bowed her head and just started crying when we saw the photos and the contents of those cadaver bags found in the defendant's Tesla. This morning, I didn't see her react. It's like she was frozen. As we saw, it was a pair of Skechers brand socks, her daughter's underwear, her leggings that were cut into pieces. And that's because her legs were allegedly cut off at the kneecaps.
Now, what's also completely insane is the fact that prosecutors have basically proven through the body cam footage of police going and searching David's home in February of 2024, one of the first times that Celeste went missing, that David himself admitted that he knew who Celeste was. He thought she was 18. He was later told she was actually 13. They met online on Discord. He had some sort of friendship or relationship with her. With that being the case, and with David now being in the courtroom, shackled up, orange jumpsuit, sitting there day in and day out as prosecutors present all of this evidence showing that this very child who David had confirmed to have known and had a relationship with passed away in the front trunk of a car that belonged to him, dismembered, her body completely torn up into pieces. You would think at the very least, if David was an innocent man in all of this and had basic human emotion, his body would freeze up. His face would look undoubtedly devastated when all this evidence was shown in court. But no, reporters claimed that David's face was completely numb. He was expressionless. Evidence is being displayed of this child that David admitted to knowing, having a friendship with, being chopped up. And he's sitting there looking at all these photos without a single emotion being displayed.
He is unshaven. He does not look like he's sleeping well behind bars. His hair is grown out, and he's got that orange jumpsuit on. He's not wearing street clothing. So it looks like a different person, but I have observed this defendant enough to know that he's got that on-off switch. He can turn on the charm when he feels like it. I've noted his interactions with the judge and with his own legal team. He can be very charming. And the fact that he's really not emoting at all. You know, when we're hearing about autopsy details, when we're hearing about the state of decomposition, when we're seeing photos of the victim's remains in cadaver bags found in his car, you know, I got to parrot what Mona said, the courtroom sketch artist. He really is off on another plane.
What's even more strange is that as authorities were searching through David's home after finding Celeste's body, not only did they find the chainsaws, the burn cages, the pool, but they also found jugs of fake blood in David's garage.
Jugs of fake blood found in David's house. What was that all about?
So one of the LAPD criminalists who took the stand to testify, it came out during her testimony that during their search of David's garage, about a week after the car was found with the victim's remains in the front trunk, they found jugs of red liquid in his garage. So obviously they went ahead and they tested it, came back negative for blood. Turns out it was fake blood, and it was being used for music merchandise that was being created in his garage. When I heard that, I thought back to some of the background research that I did before these hearings started. I watched his music videos, I watched his interviews, I looked up concert photos, I looked up his biography, and I was struck at the time by music videos, a couple of David's hits actually, where he's wearing what looks like a white t-shirt stained with fake blood. So I'm wondering if that was in fact the merchandise that was being created in his garage. And I'm wondering too if that might set up a narrative for the defense to argue that certain suspicious items, right, like burn cages, chainsaws, fireproof mats, if that might have actually been there in his home for a music video or merchandise.
During the third day of the preliminary hearing, the private investigator Steve Fisher was actually ordered to leave the courtroom by the prosecutor. This was for a number of reasons. Number one, Steve Fisher was actually one of the grand jury witnesses over the months before David was arrested. And he had allegedly also spoke to Patrick Steinfeld, who is the attorney for the family of Celeste Rivas Hernandez, in the lobby during the hearing. Steve Fisher was hired by the owner of the home that David was staying in before he got arrested, and he's been looking into the case for a while and actually did an interview with the creator Gideon and revealed some very interesting information on his findings, mainly the fact that from what he's investigated, Celeste's parents and family had known for a while that she would run off and stay with David, that she had some sort of relationship or friendship at the very least with David, which makes this case that much more disturbing.
Do you think the family is as quiet as they are because they knew who David was and they knew who she was going to, and you don't really see too much of an intervention between them?
I mean, yes. I have proof that family members have been to that rental house before, have been with David and Celeste.
Wait, her family has been to his house?
Family members. Listen, one of the first things I put down in this case was we know that David and Celeste were at Six Flags on a certain date, and we found a Build-A-Bear certificate from the Build-A-Bear place in Six Flags in her cousin's name at the house. You know, so it's like, wait a minute, so she wasn't really missing. You know what you want to know, in my opinion, what the missing persons report was about? It was to cover their ass so CPS didn't come in and say, hey, she's not going to school. What's up? If she's a missing person, you say she's not going to the school because she's a missing person. You know, then you don't have CPS in your life at that moment. You know. Listen, I sympathize. I know that they're grieving. I know they lost a daughter, but goddamn, like she shouldn't have been allowed to be. She was gone a year and a half, man. A year and a half. Like somebody should have said, you know, maybe we shouldn't be letting Celeste live her own life like this.
During the preliminary hearing, prosecutors had displayed a bunch of text messages that they retrieved from an iPhone that they got when they were doing a raid in David's home. And the messages back and forth between David and Celeste allegedly align very well with the timeline that prosecutors have already displayed. And just a trigger warning, when you keep in mind the age of both parties involved in these text exchanges, this is some of the most disturbing stuff that you will ever read. I'm going to have to omit and possibly even censor a lot of the words in these text messages, but we are going to try and go through every single exchange that David and Celeste allegedly ever had. And then we'll take a look at all the other evidence that prosecutors have displayed so you can see why the judge decided it was appropriate for this case to be taken to trial. So the first conversation between David and Celeste that was presented in court takes place on November 25th, 2023. This aligns with the timeline displayed in the complaint against David, which stated that he began an S relationship with Celeste in November of 2023. Celeste had texted David currently manifesting my time of the month because I refuse to have kids. David said, did you miss your date? You should start tracking using Flow. Flow is an app that can basically track your time of the month. He continued by saying, it's your week. I need to make sure that you're on top of your stuff. You should start tracking. And Celeste said, if I am expecting a child, I'm not having it. David then sends a link to download the Flow app where she can track her time of the month. And he also said, it's impossible that you'd be expecting a child because we both did not finish. So you can see already they're discussing having actual relations with each other. About a week later on December 1st, 2023, David texts Celeste allegedly, I have different names and aliases and stuff though. I go by Trayvon Davis here. All my packages and everything. Celeste says, please be joking, and David says, no. This is extremely disturbing because we know that David had ordered a bunch of chainsaws, burn cages, an inflatable pool, all items that prosecutors believe he may have used in the actual unaliving of Celeste. But they were ordered to his house under the name Trayvon Davis, the very same name that he told Celeste is his alias. And if you followed the David story carefully, you know that David had a lot of different personas and aliases, especially ones displayed in his music, most notably the character Atami, which I believe is the Japanese word for pain. And he used to say that he would use this character as an artistic device to commit crimes like murder, and it would be up to David himself to solve the unalivings of the character that he created in his head. About 3 weeks later, on December 20th, 2023, David texts Celeste, this stuff was fun as hell. She texts back, do I take plan B? David said, take it sober too. If you don't feel any symptoms tomorrow, just take it tomorrow. You have 72 hours. Now, before David even got arrested, there were many rumors circulating online that Celeste may have been pregnant at the time that her life was taken. And as we unpack these text messages, you'll see that the situation may have been even darker than we thought. They were texting again, December 21st. David said, why not one band when you deserve 10? And Celeste said, 10? Well, because you asked me 10 times. David said, it was 6, actually, baby. And Celeste said, how'd you know? What's interesting is something that David actually posted to his TikTok about a month after this text exchange. In the text messages, him and Celeste were allegedly talking about David sending her 10 bands, and a month later in January of 2024, he posted another text conversation, removing the name of course, where someone says to him, how many racks can I have? Give me 10 bands right now, and he sends 9,000. Also captioning the post, I can't stop falling for her. Now in January is where things seem to start getting dark. On January 8th, 2024, there was an alleged interaction between David and Celeste where David said, I'm sorry again, baby. I don't ever want to put you through this. Celeste says, no, it's okay. Don't worry. Both of us are not able to take care of it. David said, I know, but still. She said, don't worry about it, my love. He says, you're so much stronger than me, baby. I love you. She says, I love you more, my love. It's okay. Don't worry. Neither of us are capable of watching and taking care of the baby. David says, yeah, I know. When are you going to get it done? She says, 2 days. David says, also, my mom always told me to ask this if I was in this situation. It's mine, right? She says, of course, David. David replies by saying, I know, baby. I just want to ask so that I don't feel like a complete blank for her. Now, this is so disturbing and sad on so many different levels because not only does this seem to imply that they were going through an abortion, but with what David was saying, you can almost draw the assumption that his mother may have known about what was going on at the time. And later in this video, you'll see even more evidence to possibly prove that. The next day, they speak again. David asks her, wait, the appointment's at 9? No? 9:30. David said it should take 45 minutes. Then he asks, how did it go? Celeste says, about to be done, like in 10 minutes. Celeste also asked David if she can put concealer on the tattoo yet. And we know that both of them had shush tattoos on their finger. And both of them even allegedly had tattoos of each other's names on their bodies. Here's where it gets even more insane. On February 11th, 2024, they have a conversation where it seems like David is preparing Celeste to pack her things and secretly leave her home when her parents are not aware, and David, along with his security guard, would be in hiding, waiting to pick her up and bring her to David's home in time for Valentine's Day. Celeste seems scared. She seems confused, unsure if she should go through with this, but David is persistently convincing her. They also discuss something that they call Operation Awesome. And judging by the previous text messages we've already reviewed, we know what type of operation that they were preparing for. David says to her, I see you on the 14th for Valentine's Day. 15th is the operation. Celeste says, K. He says, what the F? Operation Awesome is going to be so hard. David says, hard as in it's going to be hard to do, or hard as in full Balenciaga fit type of hard. Celeste says, I don't know what to bring. David says, we've been through this for weeks. Anything that you use or can't replace immediately, you bring. Clothes you like, makeup, jewelry, shoes. Celeste asks, how am I going to bring it though? I don't have anything to bring it in. David says, I'm giving you 2 different duffel bags when I see you. Celeste replies, I don't even get half of what I want to bring in the bag. I can't carry it. I'm too small. David says, for Valentine's Day or for Operation Awesome? Celeste says, for Operation Awesome. David says, do you want me and the security guard to hide out somewhere and help you bring your stuff to the car? Celeste says, oh my gosh, no, that's so embarrassing, dude. David convinces her, saying, baby, this is the most important day of your life next to the wedding, and you're worried about being embarrassed. We're not live streaming. We're beating our phones back and getting the F out of here. Don't overthink it. Stop overcomplicating it. David also says, I'm about to go finish the phone stuff and add service, which seems to be almost implying that they're about to, when he says beat up their phones, basically like break their phones, break the phone that Celeste now has, and he's going to give her another one. Because remember, she's 12 or 13 at this time, about to run away from home, so she has to use a different phone. Then Valentine's Day comes around, and there's more coordinating to do to get Celeste out of her home. David says, so explain to me what you want to do. I'll tell security stop at the stop sign and you run out and make multiple trips out to the car. Celeste says, hell no. Just tell him get to the stop sign. David says, so how are you going to carry the heavy bag? Celeste says, it's not going to be heavy if it's that small. David says, no, you're supposed to use the duffel bag I got you and what you used last time. If that's bigger, just use that. He's basically implying that she's ran away from home to be with him before, and you'll see why that's important very shortly. But she continues, I literally don't have anything to pack with. I got a tote bag. David says, why didn't you tell me then? F it. I'll get you your 3rd Birkin bag. Why didn't you ask me for a bigger bag? You can't pack in that little bag that you have. Celeste says, all my stuff fit in the bag. And David says, me and my security will be there at 11:50 p.m. My love, I've asked you 1,000 times. Are you ready for this? Celeste says, yes. This would be around the first time that missing person photos would go up in Lake Elsinore of Celeste by her family members. It wasn't the first time she ran away, but it was the first time where you can actually find a missing person photo of her online that they were posting. Because she was reported as a missing child, in the complaint against David, they actually detail how during this time period when these text message conversations were going down and David was planning on picking her up with his security guard, detectives had actually paid a visit to David's home, asking if he knew where she was. In the complaint, it says, detectives learned that the victim had been reported missing to the Riverside County Sheriff's Department by her family, who lived in Lake Elsinore, in February and April of 2024. Again, around the same time when she's allegedly texting David about sneaking out and getting in a car with him and his security to go to his house. Riverside County Sheriff's Department telephonically contacted David on February 17th, 2024, again 3 days after Valentine's Day when he allegedly picked her up, after they identified a phone number in Celeste's phone records that belonged to David. During the call, David claimed that he had spoken to Celeste last on February 13th or 14th of 2024, but he stated that he was unaware that she was an A minor or that she had been reported missing. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department advised David that Los Angeles Sheriff's Department deputies would be coming to his home. The LA Sheriff's Department did a welfare check at David's home. They went to his home at 8:15 p.m. that night and informed him that Celeste was 13 and a runaway. David again claimed he was unaware that Celeste was an A minor and that he had only met Celeste once in person in November of 2023. However, David showed deputies a yearbook photo of Celeste he had on his cell phone. Although he claimed to be unaware of where the victim was at the time, Celeste returned home 2 days later. Despite being informed by law enforcement that Celeste was only 13, David continued to pursue her. After Celeste returned home in February 2024, her parents took her cell phone away. David drove to Lake Elsinore and paid a junior high school student in Celeste's class $1,000 to give Celeste a cell phone that David had purchased so that they could stay in contact. Throughout 2024, Celeste spent a significant amount of time with David, including summer weekends at his home in the Hollywood Hills and traveling with him to Las Vegas, London, and Texas to meet his family. Now, going forward, there's going to be a lot of stuff that I just refuse to read to you guys in terms of text conversations between David and Celeste. There was about a 5-month gap between February of 2024 and June of 2024 where we don't get any text message conversations between them. Again, this is when prosecutors allege that Celeste's parents took her phone away and David paid a high school student in Celeste's school to give her a new phone so that they could stay in contact. And this is really where the conversations escalate to be about much more intimate things, to say the least. Now, I do want to show you guys a couple important text messages because they're in reference to the whole Operation Awesome thing, right? The procedure Celeste was allegedly preparing for to remove her and David's baby. Between June 10th and 13th of 2024, Celeste texts David, "What if the first procedure to remove a child did not work?" David says, "You would have had a baby bump. You had hella times of the month since then. What are you smoking?" Celeste said, "We need to record everything we do for when we don't see each other." David agreed. Celeste said, "You deserve the best HEAD in the world." And he said, "You deserve better." Again, I don't want to get into all the intimate related conversations, but I do just want to highlight how Celeste was here questioning the efficacy of the procedure that she had done to remove her child. And as the months progress and the text messages continue, she only begins to question not just the efficacy, but also the ethics and morality behind going through with a procedure like that at such a young age and this relationship with David in general. Now you can see here's where the conversation starts getting a lot more manipulative on David's end. The idea of filming explicit content is suggested, and David says we'll do it August 11th to the 17th in Vegas at the Trump Hotel. And like I showed you guys in my previous video, prosecutors had actually shown proof of David booking flight tickets for Celeste to travel around the world with him. And you'll see why that's so much darker later in this video. But as you see in these text conversations back in June of 2024, he's already suggesting that in August they would start taking trips together to Vegas. She clowns him for booking such an expensive hotel, and David replies, "I can't wait to move in together without cops basically snooping around. I'll see you more and take you out every day." Celeste said, "I miss you so much." And David said, "You're going to be with me everywhere. 4-year vacation. Slide back, get the rest of your documents, and we get married in Italy and dip out the country. After all these OAs, aka Operation Awesomes, we can finally make it happen without all these police and posters." The posters he's talking about are all the missing person posters that were being plastered around Lake Elsinore when Celeste had run away, allegedly to David's house, and her parents did not know where she was. And you can see in these texts that Celeste begins to get more and more scared. She says, "I keep getting symptoms as if I'm expecting another child. I don't like this." David says, "It's okay, LMAO. We don't know for sure. Let's let this operation be our last one until we have the real one. And if you're actually expecting a child, we have twins, then cool. We wanted to. Anything more, and it's going up for adoption. We have a clear vision on how we want to build our family, right? I also got other business credit cards approved for you to use. So whatever you buy is a tax write-off in LA. Clothes, food, whatever you want, you can buy." She sends a jewelry emoji. David says, "I just don't want no more missing person posters, and you gotta be able to get on planes. I can pay for you. Sorry, I can pay you and give you a credit card so you don't have to worry about the money part." So as you can see here, David is clearly manipulating Celeste to spend the rest of her life with him, to travel everywhere with him, to get married, have kids. He'll get her a credit card. She can buy whatever she wants. Meanwhile, these texts show that she's scared and regretting the operations that she's already had to go through at such a young age. The next day, they discuss posting pictures of each other on Instagram and debating whether they should or not, because obviously, again, David can't be caught affiliating himself with Celeste. So she said, "Should I add one of these into the post?" David says it's between this emoji or that emoji, or this because the girl's name is in the background too. She says, "Pick the blurry one though." David says, "I want to repost. I want to post about you," type of vibe. Celeste said, "Oh, you can't. You can't see my hair there. It's red." not this person or that person thinking I got straight hair and red hair. David says, surely they remember what your hands look like. You're recognizable. Again, she had the same tattoo as David on her hand, on her finger. So by June of 2024, they're being very careful about what they post of each other online. Now, a couple days later is when we get one of the most horrifying texts, I believe, in this entire exchange, when Celeste asks David, does your mom know that we had relations yet? David said, she thinks that's the first thing we're going to do when we see each other. Celeste says, I can see you and sleep over. Just don't give me another baby, please. And he says, we've done a good job the past few months. So as you can see here, Celeste is already showing signs of regret for the operation she went through, and also seemingly implying that David's mom knew about their relationship. Keep in mind, this is months after the LAPD went to David's home and informed him that Celeste was an A minor. Now again, there's tons of other text messages that I'm purposely skipping that show David and Celeste discussing very intimate, vulgar things. I don't really think there's a purpose to review all that stuff, but just so you guys are aware, this entire situation was very inappropriate, judging by these texts. And you can obviously see that by the fact that Celeste went and had that specific operation to remove a child. So at the very least, to think that David will get off on just the charge alone of having relations with an A minor, I'm not sure how in the world his defense is going to fight that one off. In July of 2024, Celeste messages David, does anyone know that we even had intimacy? Then let's get married next year and make the baby simply. David said no, and I would like to keep it that way before we're married. Then they continue discussing more intimate things, specifically about doing things in Vegas. Again, David was going to fly Celeste to Vegas in August of 2024. And as you can even see in the complaint against David, prosecutors claimed that throughout 2024, Celeste not only spent a significant amount of time with David, but aside from spending summer weekends at his home in the Hollywood Hills, she also traveled with him to Las Vegas and London and Texas to meet his family. Now, at this point in time, she's nowhere near the age where this should have ever been appropriate. And I can't emphasize enough that David was already warned by authorities of her age in February of 2024. But yet he continued talking to her about marriage, about having children, convincing her they'd share a life together, that he would financially support her. But after that August Vegas trip, things started to get a little turbulent. On the 22nd of August, we get a text from David where he says, all right, I'm going to say one last thing and leave it on my end. You're enough for me, all I need. Used to come over after 11 p.m. We used to drink, and because of your situation, we couldn't. I was down, but I did. I made the best of the situation. You're everything to me. I only want to send reels and gifts to you. You'll always complain about people who used to be in your life. Don't get too close to other males. We can spend more time together now. Back then, when I could only spend 2 nights a week with you, back then, that was enough. Now here's where you start to see the regret build up on Celeste's end for everything they had already been through. She texts David at 2 a.m. on August 30th, 2024, saying, realistically, I care about you, but I took my child off of this earth for you. David said, it has to be the right time with the right complications. Celeste said, I still would have been there for the child. David said, yeah, selfishly, because also the child would have been mine. Celeste says, David, I have to lie to people and even lie to my kid for the rest of my life. I would do anything to have the kid back. I still took a life of an innocent literal baby. David said, then let's end that there. Celeste said, I can talk about it without crying. I'm willing to talk about my child. David said, I don't like talking when you're upset. Celeste said, how do you feel about it? And David said, I'm saddened by it, more sad of how it was conceived outside of marriage and how I pictured it. I can't change it, but I can change for the next child. The next time they spoke would be on Celeste's final birthday, September 7th, 2024. You can see that the interactions focus more and more on her stress behind carrying another one of David's children. And David continues to manipulate the situation and her. September 7th, she says, I haven't taken a test in a minute. David says, because you haven't missed your time of the month. Celeste says, I will take one when I see you. 5 days later, she says, I'm scared. I haven't got my time of the month in a minute, and we are intimate a lot. David says, because we're intimate when you're least likely to conceive a child. And Celeste says, okay, I was scared. 10 days later, she asks him nearly the same question, and they have the same conversation. And then there's no communication until November of 2024, where Celeste says, I literally was intimate with you daily for almost a year straight. And David says, you treat this like it's the first breakup. It's the 8th time. Now, I didn't have access to any text communication where it showed they were fighting or breaking up, but David's implying here that in this 2 or 3 year time span that they allegedly knew each other, they had already broken up and gotten back together 8 times. In December, they text again, and I'm not going to show you, it's more intimate stuff where basically Celeste regrets that she saw David again since they were supposed to be broken up, but they still were intimate with each other. And David basically ends that interaction by saying, this happens every time you initiate and I just go with it. You ask me to be your boyfriend, I just follow your lead. In March of 2025, Celeste would basically try and cut David loose, saying, we can be online friends, but not in person. I just want to move on. David said, okay. Celeste said, this isn't happening. I feel like we can't be in a balanced relationship. Maybe if things were different, but all we do is be intimate and hang out. I want more for myself. David said, boundary setting is terrible. Celeste said, it's more than that. And that concluded all the text conversations back and forth between David and Celeste that the prosecution had showed on day 4 of the preliminary hearing. There was a lot more interactions that we'll get to later in this video that took place on Monday, July 27th, the day that the judge decided this case is going to trial. But in the meantime, I want to take a look at some of the reporters who were actually in the courthouse that day that all these text messages were shown and show you guys some more info that they had firsthand of that courtroom hearing, other evidence that was displayed, and David's reaction to all of these alleged text messages that took place between him and Celeste throughout all of these years.
This was actually the first instance, Chris, during this preliminary hearing where it seemed to me like David was actively engaged in his own defense. Today was the first time I actually noticed him using the pen or pencil in front of him and that yellow legal notepad that I keep on peeking at, trying to see if he's taking any notes. Before today, I haven't seen him writing anything down, and I've got an eye on him at all times just to see how he's reacting to what's being said about him, his actions. Nothing before today, not a single thing written down. But today, as they were talking about the photos found on his phone and the text messages recovered from his iCloud account, I did notice him hunching over and starting to jot something down. I did notice him having whispered conversations with his attorneys. At one point, this was when, and this was really tough. This was actually what prompted the victim's mother to start crying and both of her parents to walk out of the courtroom, flanked by their attorney. But when they were describing the incredibly explicit images of David and Celeste engaged in various types of sexual activity found on David's phone, I noticed David losing his composure a little bit. The entire time that I've been watching him in court during this hearing and the status conferences before this, he has been very still, very composed, staring straight ahead, responding when spoken to, and not giving away much with his body language or his facial expressions. Today, when they were talking about the photos, when they were talking about his pics, you could see him starting to fidget. It was like he was shrinking in his seat. He looked down at one point. I could see his right leg jiggling up and down. And I'm really curious what he wrote down. Really curious what he shared with his attorneys during that exchange. Because it wasn't just one photo or two that LAPD Detective Corey Farrell described on the stand. It was a series of photos, probably dozens. You know, it got to a point where there were so many descriptions. They were so explicit. You can see in my notes, Chris, I actually stopped describing them one by one. And I just started grouping them into categories, you know, of genitalia, the two of them engaging in sexual intercourse. The list goes on and on. That portion of testimony went on for much longer than I expected it to. We have not even gotten to cross-examination of this witness yet.
It's very interesting because in my previous video, I showed you guys how David was pretty much expressionless the entire time that the prosecution was mainly detailing the state that they found Celeste's body in the front trunk of David's Tesla. And that really speaks to his character. If this was someone he was truly talking to so heavily for all of these years, right? Manipulating her into being in an inappropriate relationship with him. It's insane to think that when prosecutors were showing him and the judge these pictures of her body completely lifeless in a trunk of a Tesla that belonged to him, his face showed no emotion. But yet, when they start showing these intimate photos and text messages between David and Celeste, that's when he starts showing a reaction on his face. And speaking of Celeste's cause of death, many people wondered why it took so long for prosecutors to not just arrest David, but determine a cause of death. And they actually explained the reasoning for that during this hearing.
There's been a big question about cause of death in this case. We know something horrific happened to this young woman, her body dismembered according to police. What was the piece of information you saw come out of this? Piece of information that came out of this just related to how we know Celeste died at this point?
So there was a lot of buzz around this autopsy that was conducted last fall after the body was found, and it took about 3 months for them to actually release their final findings. And we learned today that's because they had to do some ancillary testing. Essentially, this deputy medical examiner, he was one of 2 people involved in doing the autopsy. They wanted to wait for toxicology testing to come back to confirm that she didn't die from an overdose. They wanted to know that before releasing this report and finalizing their finding that it was, in fact, penetrating injuries, multiple penetrating injuries that killed her. So Dr. Grant Ho, the LA County Deputy Medical Examiner, spent quite a bit of time today describing the injuries he found, describing how the penetrating wounds to the overlying skin are associated with internal damage found inside. That includes damage to the victim's liver. He described how he used his own fingers to palpate her ribs, how he found damage or disruptions to that underlying bone, how that sits right beneath a second penetrating wound that he found on her left flank. So he painted a very clear picture of what happened to this 14-year-old. Now, here's what the defense did with that. It was Marilyn Bednarski leading cross-examination of Dr. Grant Ho this morning. She made it very clear. You may have these findings. You may have this autopsy report. You may have these shocking visuals, but you don't actually know for sure what kind of sharp instrument was used. You don't actually know for sure which penetrating wound occurred first. You don't know for sure if they happened seconds apart. And then defense actually insinuated today during cross-examination of this witness that they don't know for sure if the victim herself may have been holding the knife that stabbed her. There were a couple looks exchanged in the courtroom after Bednarski said that. And after the witness did in fact confirm that no, he does not know due to the advanced state of decomposition of the victim's remains. But everybody looked around. And I think that bordered on absurd to a couple of the people in the courtroom I spoke with during the lunch break. But that's how defense is handling this. These are sharp defense attorneys. They are aggressively doing their job. And I'm so curious to see how they attack this digital evidence from David and Celeste's iPhones when we pick this back up on Monday morning.
Now here's where it gets insanely depressing. And just to think about the added context of all these text messages back and forth, it adds so much weight to how tragic this loss of life truly was. This was a child that was manipulated into being in an inappropriate relationship. This was someone who was visibly distraught at the fact that she went through an operation as traumatic as removing her own child. In these text messages, that seemed to be the cause of a lot of the conflict in their back and forth. And because of the state that her body was found in, it's extremely hard to decipher what actual object was used to take Celeste's life and who it actually was that took Celeste's life. And while there's an insane amount of evidence that links David to Celeste, at least on a personal level, unfortunately in a court of law, that's not enough to concretely say that he was the one who took her life. And you can already see the defense trying to leverage the fact that her body was decomposing for so long and that it's so hard to actually tell what it was that actually took her life. And they're even disgustingly trying to use that as an argument to say, well, we can't rule out that Celeste was not the one to do this to herself.
They decided the cause and manner of death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez was homicide, and they attributed her death to multiple penetrating injuries. Here's what's interesting, though. They did not identify what kind of weapon or tool caused those penetrating injuries. And they stopped short of actually calling it a penetrating injury caused by a sharp instrument. So they're not saying that she was definitely stabbed to death. And that's because of the advanced state of decomposition. They simply don't know for sure exactly how or what caused a lot of what they found, which we are looking at right now in the courtroom, documented in these very, very visual exhibits.
Let me tell you why that's so significant. You know, but our audience should know. One of the special circumstance allegations in this case that has been presented by prosecutors is that David Anthony Burke personally used a deadly and dangerous weapon, a sharp instrument, to commit this crime. And yet what you're telling us is this deputy medical examiner can't definitively say that that's the case.
We don't know that for sure. And I think defense attorneys made a point of underscoring that several times. That is one of the elements of this first-degree felony murder charge that is interesting, that is different. And if he is convicted, there could be a sharp instrument enhancement. I believe in the state of California that could tack on an additional consecutive year. But those 3 additional special circumstances, that makes this murder case eligible for the death penalty. Here's what else the deputy medical examiner doesn't know for sure. And defense leaned really hard into all of this on cross. They don't know which penetrating injury occurred first. There's one on the victim's abdomen, and there's one on her lateral left chest. So one is associated possibly with liver damage, the other possibly with rib damage and diaphragm damage. Deputy Emmy can't say which one happened first. He can't say definitively whether or not they may have happened seconds apart. He cannot say which one caused her death. He cannot say how long it may have taken Celeste to die from either one of those injuries. There's so much we simply don't know. And that created a gap for one of the defense attorneys to ask something that we have not heard yet in this case. She asked this witness, this deputy medical examiner, if he could rule out that Celeste may have inflicted both of these stab wounds on her own. And he said, based on his findings in this autopsy, that was not something that he could definitively rule out. The reaction in the courtroom following that line of questioning, though, I turned around and I could see a couple people, glancing at each other, eyebrows raised. It looked and felt to me like people watching this line of questioning felt like it may have been bordering on the absurd. It may not be something a jury would believe.
Let's map that out for a second. So in other words, and this is based on what we saw this week from the defense, they are potentially building the argument, if this goes to trial, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Celeste would have come over to his place, something happened, she killed herself or had an overdose, David panicked and tried to get rid of her body. I mean, is that something that you see the building blocks for, even though they've tried to, because remember, one of the most significant things I think the defense has been trying to do is saying, well, all these alleged purchases the chainsaws, the laundry bags, the body bag. It was all after she allegedly died. So it's not like he planned to kill her. Am I understanding that that's maybe the building blocks of where they may go as a potential defense?
Jesse, I don't know if that's where the defense is actively trying to go. I think this is their opportunity during this preliminary hearing to kind of test out different lines of questioning, right? See what sticks. See where the biggest openings might be for them to just create more gaps in the prosecution's case. I don't believe that line of questioning is going to go anywhere. But here's how they laid it out this morning. Marilyn Bednarski was the one asking Dr. Grant Ho these questions. She wanted to know first, is it helpful for somebody doing an autopsy to maybe have information about whether the decedent has a mental health history? Is it helpful to know if they are suicidal? Is it helpful to know if they are habitual drug users? So to each of those questions, Dr. Ho answered, potentially. So then she asked him, did you have any conversations with the decedent's relatives to explore those characteristics? He did not. Then she proceeded to ask about the injuries, right? The documented injuries, these penetrating wounds, the disruption to one of her ribs, the damage noted on her liver. And the defense wants to know, can you definitively link those observations that were made during the autopsy to what you see on the overlaying skin? And do you know exactly how that occurred? Are you able to definitively report that somebody else caused those injuries? And I think the broad answer to all of this is the advanced state of decomposition precludes a lot of definitive information. The deputy ME simply cannot say how this happened or who did this to her.
So with all this in mind, with us still being unsure of how specifically Celeste lost her life, let's dive into the next day of the preliminary hearing, where prosecutors showed text messages between David and Celeste on the night that Celeste had allegedly been believed to have lost her life. Remember that the last text interaction we saw between David and Celeste occurred in March of 2025, where Celeste had basically told David that they can only be friends online. Well, now we get to April 23rd, 2025. So before we see these text messages, David walked into the courtroom appearing relaxed and in good spirits. He smiled and whispered with his defense attorney, Burke, and at one point he seemingly joked with the courtroom clerk about water. Deputy District Attorney Beth Silverman resumed Detective Farrell's testimony by establishing that David and Celeste remained in regular contact through mid-March 2025 and exchanged between 8,000 to 9,000 text messages before her passing. Silverman focused on conversations in this hearing from April 22nd to 26th, 2025, which was the time period leading to the loss of Celeste's life. And these messages also included discussion about David's friendship with another woman by the name of Aisha Collins. Beth Silverman then walked through the April 23rd conversation in which David and Celeste coordinated an Uber ride to David's home. The messages showed that David ordered the ride at Celeste's request, confirming the pickup location and tracking the driver's arrival. At 5:07 p.m., David asks, "Why do I have to show you everything I get?" Celeste says, because I had your baby in me." Celeste says, "Get an Uber, queen." David said, "Getting it." Celeste then texts David the name of the street that her family was living on at the time to call the Uber to. David tells her the Uber is 1 minute away, then says the Uber's here. Then at 8:39 p.m., Celeste says, "Okay." Then says, "Girly pop, I'm almost there. Open your door if you're home." David says, "I got you." And at this point in the courtroom, there's no emotion, no movement from David. At 10:10 p.m., David says, "The gate is open, the door is unlocked." And at 10:31 p.m., David says, "Uber said you're here. Where you at?" This is where it gets dark. After this, David repeatedly texted Celeste, asking where she was. His final messages were sent around 11:41 p.m. that night. The prosecution then shifted to digital evidence. Detective Farrell testified Uber records showed that the ride actually arrived to David's home at 10:10 p.m. Prosecutors also introduced evidence regarding cell phone movements, David's Tesla, and a photograph of the Tesla's navigation screen showing Santa Barbara destinations, including Lake Cachuma and a Tesla supercharger in Santa Ynez. And remember that Celeste's ID, her driver's license, had been found by a random bystander in Santa Barbara very shortly after this. Then it was David's defense team's turn to question all the text messages, all the evidence that the prosecutors had presented. His lawyer had established that through text message conversations, Celeste had represented herself as both 16 and 18 at different times, and noted that the defense had prepared their own compilation of raw iCloud message data. Basically, aside from all the text messages that the prosecutor showed the judge during these hearings, David's defense team also had other messages between David himself and Celeste that they also wanted to show in defense of David. And with that included some conversations that took place between April 22nd and 23rd, pointing to messages where Celeste threatened to unalive David and ruin his music career, contact his mother, leak damaging information, and spread information to people in his personal life. And the detective had agreed that those messages did exist. David's lawyer then questioned the detective about the extent to which David and Celeste's relationship was known to other people before April of 2025, when prosecutors believe her life was taken. The detective testified that Celeste's parents, her relatives, her friends, and David's mother were all aware of their relationship. The detective also confirmed that David attended church with Celeste's family, spent time with them at malls and amusement parks, and that Celeste's parents signed a notarized travel consent form allowing David to take Celeste to London in September of 2024. This was all found through text message evidence. The detective also testified that Celeste attended Coachella and David's performances with people in David's inner circle. David's lawyer then seemed to be insinuating that Celeste was abusive towards David, pointing to one of the messages that was sent from David to Celeste, saying, "Oh my gosh, I will unalive you. She was in my damn seat. I will tell my dad so many freaking lies about you, and I will end your career and your life. I will damage anything." David's team also focused into Celeste's arrival at David's house, because there's a lot of questions there that are left unanswered. The detective testified that investigators determined David was playing a virtual reality game with other people while Celeste was traveling in the Uber on the way to David's house. He also agreed that there were no eyewitnesses who saw Celeste exit the Uber or enter into David's property. There was no surveillance video showing either Celeste or David outside the home, and no witness who observed what occurred during the roughly 20-minute period that investigators believe encompassed Celeste's passing. The detective also further acknowledged that the Uber driver who drove Celeste to David's home allegedly had no independent recollection of the ride and could not confirm the exact time that she was dropped off. So all in all, David's defense wrapped up their arguments by saying that prosecutors had not proven the three quote-unquote special circumstances that can make the alleged crime more serious. Number one, lying in wait. Celeste allegedly chose to come over while David was gaming with friends, so the defense says there is no proof that he planned a surprise attack on her. Number two is financial gain. There is no clear evidence that he acted to protect his future music career or to save himself from getting prosecuted if she went to authorities and revealed that he was in a relationship with her. No evidence, all speculation. Number three, killing a witness. There is no evidence that Celeste threatened to report him to the police. Overall, the defense said that the case relies only on indirect evidence and does not clearly show what David was doing when Celeste was allegedly unalived. But the prosecutor began arguing the exact opposite, saying that all three circumstances were actually connected. Number one, when it comes to lying in wait, even if Celeste arranged the meeting, aka, coordinated the idea of going to David's house, she did not know what David allegedly planned. Prosecutors say that he expected her arrival and deliberately put her in a vulnerable position. In terms of financial gain, Celeste allegedly threatened his rapidly growing multi-million-dollar music career. Prosecutors argue that silencing that threat protected his image and future earnings. Number three, unaliving a witness. Celeste had allegedly threatened to expose their relationship. The prosecutor says that David unalived her to prevent a report that could have led to criminal charges, even though no case existed at that point. The prosecutors basically believe that Celeste, with, growing anger and resentment towards David, had threatened to reveal that they had been in a relationship to the world and to authorities. And that would, of course, compromise David's lucrative music career. And because of that, he agreed for her to come over. And when she did, he unalived her with the intention of keeping her silent so that his secret wouldn't be exposed to the world. And with that, the judge said, this thing is going to trial. Thankfully, the much-deserved justice and closure for Celeste's family will have the chance to be attained in a court of law. Rest in peace to Celeste.
Okay, so I've just come back out of the courthouse. We've heard some more of the messages that were sent after the previous session, which were pretty bad, okay, but we now have seen the text messages between David and Celeste right up until the moment that she actually was invited to his house and sent there in an Uber and allegedly lost her life at the hands of David. Now, what was very, very interesting was we kind of heard this report of a very tense back and forth where she basically threatened to expose him. Now, what's crazy about this, I personally don't think it's right to victim blame anybody, so I'm definitely not supporting anybody that's saying that by any means she created the situation where this happened or that she deserved this. But what was said in court that was very interesting was that they had gone back and forth. They had had a massive argument, and what was crazy, they had apparently had a back and forth where Celeste was jealous about David's friendships, or more than friendships potentially, with other people, including Asia. Now, there was apparently a message from Celeste that said, but can you tell me why you want to be friends with Asia? And David said, oh, she's a friend of mine. And then she's basically saying, oh, you keep bumping into her, there's no need for friendship with her. She was basically jealous, and they went back and forth. And she'd said to him, oh, you really end our friendship just to be friends with her over me. It's disturbing and disgusting on a deeper level. It's actually crazy. Celeste even said to her, like, oh, I've known you for years. You've only known Asia for a year. I don't want to be friends with you if you're still going to be friends with her, which is insane. Now, what is also interesting is kind of after that, they went back and forth, and Celeste was basically very jealous of Asia, basically said, why was she at your house? And David was like, oh, she only came to my house to get Coachella wristbands. There was a good reason everyone was at the house. Basically, I'll keep it real with you. Look, I'm just going to tell you what she said. This is insane. I can't even believe I'm letting you guys know this. But they were having this big back and forth argument about Asia. And then Celeste basically said, this is what I've written down, all right? Said, oh my God, I swear to God, I will kill you. I couldn't believe it. They said she was in my seat. I guess she was sat in the seat of the car that Celeste usually sits in. She said, I will kill you. I will you and tell my dad so many lies about you and end your career and do so much damage. And then went on to say she posted at your house, you weirdo. So that was like that was, I believe, the day before the alleged murder. And then the following day, like, they kind of squashed it. And basically, apparently, Celeste had kept saying to David, I want to see you in person. I want to see you in person. And then he basically said, okay, come round. I'm going to send an Uber for you at like 8:39. Ended up sending the Uber, and she was delivered to his house. David actually replied to that saying, you've turned this into a bigger thing than this conversation, and basically said, this is how it goes with you. You have to find out after the fact that you don't listen to me. It was a bit of a weird response to that, but that's what was going on, is that basically she kind of allegedly threatened to kill him, to expose him. She also said, basically she said, nah, I don't play like that. I don't even play like that. I'll go to Val's door on some crazy knocking and crying. So she basically said she was going to expose him. She said she was going to put it out there that he had all this crazy stuff going on. And basically, she also said that she had a whole bunch of stuff like on her phone, a whole bunch of dirt on him that she was going to expose. Basically, the defense are trying to pull this defense that like she kind of threatened him, and that I guess there was some kind of fear. Maybe she struck fear into David's heart of killing. But the reality is, for Celeste, those were just words. And for David, these were actual alleged actions. And she was the one that was found deceased. So I'm not buying it. I'm not having it. That saying that to anybody. That's definitely wrong to say that. But this is just this is an angry little kid that's just whiling out. There's no excuse, no self-defense argument to be had here. But like I said, the defense are really trying to reach for anything that they could possibly get. And there were a couple more things that look like they could work in their favor. But I don't think it's enough to justify or explain away the literal of a little girl.
Now, this is so incredibly sad to think about for a multitude of reasons. Number one, David was a shy, homeschool kid with not many friends as he grew up. He quickly launched into superstardom at a very young age and went from having nothing to everything at the snap of a fingers. He befriended a child while he himself was 18 years old, obviously had a very demented sense of what a healthy relationship should look like, inappropriately engaged with a minor, and used his power to cover up the entire thing. If what the evidence presented is true, David was the golden goose. He was earning millions of dollars for a multitude of different people. He was flying a child to London simply because he had the financial resources to do so, and people around him who were incentivized to cover up his mess for financial gain. And when it's all said and done, and that young child lost her life, whether or not it was David who committed the crime, all parties involved believe that his power, influence, and finances would be enough to absolve him from the consequences and wipe her memory off the face of this earth. Let's just pray that her family can get the justice they so rightfully deserve.